Today's social media segment is brought to you by South Louisiana Bank. It's better when we bank together. Waits and Downer, attorneys at law. Terrebonne Ford, built Ford tough.
There are trucks, and then there's the GMC Sierra, available with the connected driving experience and the world's first 6-function multi-pro tailgate. GMC Sierra. It's the truck. Or get $3,500 purchase cash on select GMC Sierra models. Or get a total of $6,000 purchase allowance when you trade in an eligible vehicle. See your local GMC dealer.
All right, it's that time again. It's good vibes time. I'm Martin Falls, and joining us, the lovely Debbie Cox-DeNova. She is in the house. Debbie, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. All right, so I've heard more and more of this lately. Seen it in the news, heard it on a local level. Healing from toxic heartbreak. We need to talk about that.
We really need to talk about that.
Right.
And, I'm making the distinction here because healing from heartbreak is difficult all by itself. But when you're in a stable, healthy relationship, the healing process is rather clean, right? You might go through some nostalgia, some grief, but you end up with a sense of gratitude for the lessons that you got from that very secure relationship, and you move forward quite cleanly. When you're recovering from a toxic relationship, it is much more complicated and much more difficult. So it's been likened, and we talked about trauma bonding before, right? The abuse cycle, that tension building, and it leads to an incident. And then, of course, after the incident is the reconciliation phase, right? And then the calm. And in those reconciliation and calm periods, there's a lot of really good things that happen, right? And the more, let's just talk about narcissistic abuse, for example. Narcissists run on a spectrum. So you can have the grandiose narcissist, but you can also have covert narcissist, malignant in between. And when you have someone who is less prone to the bad days, because with narcissists specifically, you're going to have two versions of them showing up, okay? When you have less bad days and more good days, it becomes even more difficult. And that's the thing about toxic relationships is there are good days. There are many good days oftentimes, and that's the part that keeps that trauma bond going, because you take those days and you treasure them. And if you're somebody who's been in a toxic relationship for a long period of time, you become a master storyteller about those treasures. But that time we went bike riding, and he or she is always so funny, and then those good days. And the reality is that when you're dealing with someone who has toxic patterns within a relationship, when they're feeling safe, or in the case of a narcissist, when they have enough supply, they can actually show up quite nicely. They're generous, they're kind. Sometimes they're even quite empathic, right? But then the other version of themselves, sort of the underbelly that shows up, is when they don't feel safe or they're not getting enough supply. In which case, they can be very moody at like the very least, right? They can be mean, they can be aggressive, they can be just awful to deal with. And so it leaves the person within the relationship sort of evaluating. On the days that are good, they feel ungrateful and confused, right?
So men get their share of the blame. We just saw P. Diddy beating up his girlfriend, which was just horrific.
Right.
But women could be toxic too.
Of course.
So it goes both ways.
It absolutely goes both ways. And when we're talking about toxicity, a lot of times it's not physical abuse. Like, when you see someone being physically abusive, there's no question. We talked about that before. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, there's no question what we're looking at, right? It's the emotional abuse that can be much more, people are less likely to get involved. They're less likely to report it, get up in arms about it. And especially with emotionally toxic people, because what they tend to do is show a good persona to other people. So if you're you're in a relationship with someone who has toxic patterns, in all likelihood, the people that see them on occasion might actually like them quite a lot, which makes it even more confusing when you're going through a rough time, because so many people in your community are actually really liking them, right? So there's this, and then the people, of course, who know about things, they actually go, what are you doing with this person? This person is horrible to you. They yell at you. They hurt you in all these different ways. They lie, they manipulate. So it can leave the person who is in the relationship feeling quite shameful. They feel vulnerable. They feel like they're self-judging. Like, what am I doing? Like, why can't I get out of this? But we've talked about vasopressin bonding, right? This is a very strong way of human connection, even stronger than oxytocin. You go through stresses with a person, and there is that neurochemical that flows to get you back together. And especially when you're going back and forth, where you're, and this is what happens in toxic relationships, is that it's a cycle of, when there's a rupture, there's a big incident that happens. What happens is a pulling apart and a coming together. So all this cortisol flows whenever things aren't going right, right? Cortisol, epinephrine. And then the person who ends up making it better is the same person who abused you. So it's a lot of ways like Stockholm Syndrome. Are you familiar with Stockholm Syndrome? So Stockholm Syndrome was something that was studied, where they observed that the captives, or people who were being held captive by someone, ended up creating emotional bonds with them, right? So it's basically creating an emotional bond with somebody who's perpetrating harm on you.
Right.
And so what is found is, and it's a coping mechanism, right? Especially if you're used to fawning and kind of moving in and making sure that the person is doing okay, what naturally happens is that you form a watertight bond over time. So if you know people at home, if you know someone who's been in a toxic cycle, please have some understanding that this person is not stupid, not foolish, that it actually mirrors an addiction cycle. And it can actually be super confusing, and purposely so, because a lot of times toxic is about control, right? So they do it on purpose.
When I saw the P. Diddy video, made me nauseated, because I'm sitting there thinking, where was he before he got caught?
Right.
Where was he trying to get better? He wasn't.
Right.
Then he gets caught. Then he comes on and says all the perfect right things. Somebody helped him write it. But it said all the right things, looked off, looked sad, but wait to do that after you start getting help and you separate from the thing, and then maybe people buy it, but I just didn't buy the whole apology.
Well, and that's the part we talked about, right? In a true relationship, when there's a rupture, or, the repair process is real. When it's a toxic relationship, you can notice that his apology was sort of kind of like, to whom? Who are you apologizing to? And it came on the back end of him denying it. It was only till there was proof and people were up in arms that this apology came out.
There's a video.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so now, the best move is to go ahead and
to save
apology.
my empire.
Right.
All right, let's take a break. We'll be right back. Very important topic. Don't go away.
Social media segment is brought to you by Terrebonne General Health System. Your health is our legacy. Rouse's, you're either local or you're not. Buick, the craft of modern luxury. St. Martin and Bork, know your rights.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about toxic healing. Well, healing after a toxic relationship, I should say, or a toxic heartbreak. And Debbie Cox-DeNova is back here. And I'm thinking, as we go into the break, all the toxicity relationships that I see, people aren't yoked together. I mean, one of them goes to church, one of them doesn't. One of them likes this, one of them doesn't. One of them likes to go to ballrooms, the other one doesn't. My dad used to always say, you meet them in a ballroom, they may leave you in a ballroom. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but don't you really have to find somebody you have a lot in common with?
You do. And so here's the problem with many toxic relationships is that in the very beginning stage, in that honeymoon stage, if you will, there's a love bombing process that happens. And with that love bombing comes this false confluence. So in other words, the abuser actually knows that in order to get this relationship to bond quickly, he or she has to present like, oh, we have all this stuff in common. You feel that way. I feel that way
I love
too.
cats.
Right. Absolutely. And so they'll put up whatever mask they need to in order to create this fast bonding experience with them and to lock them in quickly so that by the time something else shifts, they're already emotionally entwined. And you got to remember too that people who end up in these relationships often do so because they've been familiarized to it as children. There's some sort of, because very secure relationships, people who've been in secure relationships or have witnessed secure relationships from the start, they are not available to be treated in a harmful way, right? They recognize these red flags and they're like, absolutely not. You are manipulating me, you're lying right now, and they exit the scene, right? And so what happens is that people who are prone to these toxic patterns look for people who are a match for it, who are actually willing to put up with this, who are willing to tell themselves stories about what could be and look for their potential and help them to heal things. They know exactly what to say. They know how to be in the moments where they're losing them during that breach where there's an incident, and right after, remember, they're real vulnerable right there.
Oh, yeah.
That's when they know how to bring out the sob story about maybe, their trauma in the past and get the other person to move in to bridge that gap. And it feels really good to the abused partner because of the familiarity.
Play the victim.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And so you have to remember that there's a manipulation process to control victims. So if you know somebody, it's very important that they get help. And it's important, too, that if you feel that you are in a relationship like this and when you separate from this person, it feels almost like a sense of devastation. Remember, there's that primal devastation that comes from these toxic relationships that is not there when you break up with a secure relationship, right? It's like this primal devastation because there is a trauma bond that has created this tight bond. You don't even know who you are sometimes. You don't feel like you know who you are without that person, right? So it's important to recognize that all of the good parts, because this is what's so confusing, like there were good parts. This relationship has all these good things. Most of these days feel really good. We're cooking together. We're going on dates. He's rubbing my feet. She's being so sweet to me. Those days are real. The good is real. But so are the bad. So is the lying. So is the manipulation. So is the gaslighting. And you really do, according to Dr. Ramani, have to judge your relationships on the bad days.
I got to say this because there was a famous preacher around here one time who got caught with a prostitute and gave this big thing that he had sinned and everything else. And I'm sitting there going, I'd have been much more respectful to the person if he'd have just come on and say, you know what? Me and my wife are not having good sex. We've been together all these years. It's not like it used to be. I got weak. I went out and I was a man. I felt the need. Yeah. Instead of the apology always comes after the fact. Just own up to it and move on.
Right. Exactly. Well,
he didn't beat his wife. It's a whole nother thing.
Sure.
If you're beating on the wife, that's a whole nother game.
Well, the apologies often don't pass the sniff test if you're a secure person and you're watching. There's something a little bit false about the way that the apology is issued. Not in all cases. In some cases, the perpetrator actually does feel sorrow, right, in the moment. But remember, there can be a flipping over to a different kind of, when you feel very insecure as a person who's in a toxic relationship, there is a vulnerability that makes you want to close that bridge, that breach between the two of you. But then going back, what will inevitably happen is they will go back to their old ways. So it's important for victims to recognize that those bad days are what you should be judging your relationship on, because that's where you need people the most in relationships. When someone dies or you're not feeling well, you need someone to be able to show up in a healthy way for you. And so you need to not be dismissing this. And one of the most important things is that when we walk away from these relationships and we're after the breakup, we're walking away with stories that are very harmful to us in the future. They keep us from being vulnerable in new relationships. So we say, everyone's going to be like this, or every time I open myself up to love, this happens, and those are very disempowering stories that will keep you from the love in the future. The better and more empowering story is, I missed the red flags. I missed the signals that told me that this relationship was not good for me.
And as you get older, you will see the red flag. And it's not just, is that person good for me? If you have wisdom, sometimes you go, I'm really not good for that person.
Sure, yeah.
Because that person likes to sit home and do nothing and read. And, you know, the other person may want to be going out and talking with politicians and going to social events and hobnobbing, and she never wants to leave the house, or vice versa.
Sure.
And so sometimes you go, okay, I'm not getting into this one because it's a train wreck waiting to happen.
That's it. And that's just a compatibility thing, right? And so if you're in a healthy relationship and you break up, that you agreeing to that at the end represents, remember, that new shared context where you can walk away, but you can actually feel good that we agree that this isn't going to work out. But the trauma bonds, that's a whole different animal.
All right. See you next week on Good Vibes.